Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for the Collaborator, which is episode 24 of season 2 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Deep Space Nine as determined by my user polls. The episode to win my latest user poll, or at least the first one in the series, is the Deep Space Nine episode, The Collaborator. So, The Collaborator is the episode where 2 days before the election to determine the next Kai, Kira is tasked by Winn to investigate a scandal where a Bajoran informant informed to the Cardassians, which got a handful of resistance fighters killed, including Kai Opaka's son. And Kira determines that Bariel was involved. So Bariel drops out of the running for Kai, and Winn is elected the new Kai. Kira later learns that Bariel didn't inform to the Cardassians that it was in fact Kai Opaka herself, and Bariel was just covering for her. So this was I think this is an often overlooked episode. I think this was actually one of the better earlier Bajoran episodes. I quite enjoyed this myself. Now, this episode is pretty interesting to look at from a production standpoint, because originally when Bariel was first introduced, he was he was introduced for the sole purpose of becoming the next Kai. They wanted another character who could become Opaka's successor. So that was their plan all along, and it's described by the writers themselves that they changed this plan at the last minute. Ira Stephen Bear is noted as saying that, wait a second, if we have someone who's an ally to our main characters become Kai, then that kind of cripples us from a story writing standpoint, because the better situation would be to have an adversary or someone who's antagonistic to our main characters become Kai, because that would create more conflict, and conflict creates more drama, and drama creates more storytelling. And I can kind of see their point of view there. I do believe that by not making Bariel Kai, it did kind of make his character kind of unnecessary, which is probably why they killed him off. I do believe in the very next appearance, or maybe he appeared one other time before he died, but shortly thereafter he was killed off, because unfortunately, yeah, this whole purpose of this character was to become Kai, so if he doesn't become Kai, kind of don't need him. And I don't know, I have mixed feelings about Winn being Kai. I mean, that does seem kind of like an artificial way to create tension, but what I don't get is in the episode itself, it talks about how this episode, I think earlier episodes, is mentioned that Winn has a very small following, and she wasn't necessarily the next runner-up to become Kai after Bariel. There were other people. So they didn't really explain why, just because Bariel dropped out, like Winn became Kai. It's because she's a character we're familiar with. But anyway, it's also interesting to look at is apparently the original idea for this episode was it was going to be about a Bajoran who collaborated with the Cardassians, and he's involved in some sort of conspiracy. I think that it was said that he murdered someone, and Kira is investigating him, so it's supposed to be a murder investigation, and eventually it's revealed that it wasn't him who did it, it was his daughter, and he was covering for her. So you can see how, aspects of that story is what growed into this, because they keep aspects of it. And I have to say that original story idea does sound pretty cliche. That's kind of stuff that we've seen before a lot, not just in Star Trek, but in all film and television, particularly in the 80s and 90s. It was quite common to have that misdirection of you think this guy's the murderer, but actually they're covering from someone else. And I will say, it's probably a good example of how the story writing process works, and how they start with one idea that's kind of basic, but then they flesh it out more. Like really good shows like Deep Space Nine anyway will flesh it out more and turn it into something a bit more unique, whereas bad shows that are a bit more typical and cliche, like the throwaway episodic television that aired in the 90s and 80s a lot, wouldn't go beyond that. They would just air that very basic idea, and so you come up with seeing the same things over and over again. And I don't know, I'll talk about this more when I do my review of What We Left Behind, but if you've seen the newest documentary about Deep Space Nine, What We Left Behind, they show them, the writers coming up with this idea for the first episode of season 8, and I myself said I didn't think it was very good, but I had to allow for the fact that this was basically just the first draft. That this was kind of just a fun exercise where the writers got together and they fleshed out a story idea. I'm sure in the actual production, and this episode is a good example of that, they'll come up with a very basic idea, but then other people will come on board, they'll flesh it out, they'll work on it more, they'll develop it, and it will turn into something completely different that's more developed and more unique. Whereas what they did in that documentary, they only did in a day, so it only really shows the first step, and they present it as a finished product. But if it was the actual TV show, it wouldn't be the finished product. They would work on the idea more and develop it into something better. So I love. But anyway, I'll talk about that more when I do my review for that. But anyway, they said that when they were writing this episode that they were purposely trying to make parallels to Watergate. I don't know if I necessarily see that, because the Watergate scandal, that's an example of a scandal that actually is scandalous, but we find out here that this scandal, there's more to it than meets the eye, which I don't think really compares well to Watergate, but maybe it's just because that's a famous scandal that happened, of course, before this episode aired, so that's probably why they took some inspiration from it, but I don't think it was the primary message of the episode. Anyway, getting back to the original story idea, because you see elements of that, particularly with the Cardassian collaborator who we meet is Secretary Kubis. In fact, this episode apparently was the first time it was ever mentioned there was a Bajoran government during the Cardassian occupation who are now seen as all collaborators, and they were all exiled from Bajor because they were complicit in the enslavement and murder of many of the Bajoran populace, which makes sense, and it's a bit more complex that they would have these Bajoran governments who are basically just puppets doing what the Cardassians wanted in order to present it as if, to put up a face and present it as if these orders were coming from Bajorans themselves. Not just to the Bajoran people, but to the outside world. Like if the Federation or anyone else tried to intercede, they could be like, no, this is an internal Bajor thing. Look, here's Bajorans running their own government, when really they were just puppets for the Cardassians. So that aspect of it does make a lot of sense. Now, as for the character of Kubis himself, as I said, this came out of the original story idea, but I think this is an element that does seem kind of out of place. It does seem like a remnant of that original story idea, and it does kind of fit into this new what the episode actually is, because it's the catalyst for this whole scandal that Kira has to investigate. But it seems like it's kind of a story thread that's not fully developed to me. It seems like they introduce it at the first part of the episode, but then it's kind of quickly forgotten. And we never actually do find out whatever become of Kubis. I just realized that. Like, they never actually... Was he denied and turned around, not allowed to go to Bajor? Or did they allow him to continue? I suppose he was denied because Kai Winn had no further use of him, she already became Kai. And she would probably save face by denying him, but I wish that would have at least been mentioned in the episode, but whatever. I talked about it in my Season 2 review where I touched on this episode briefly about how it's an interesting dilemma of the Secretary Cubis, because if you got to think about it this way, because Kira thinks that they went lightly on him, and she was like telling him how he could never return to Bajor because it would dishonor the memory of all the people that he sentenced to death. But his counter argument is, well, he would have died if he refused. Like Kira said, did you refuse to sign any of the order? Actually, he didn't make the counter argument. It's kind of implied. He just answered simply, no, I didn't refuse any of the orders. But it's pretty easy to infer that the reason why he didn't is because he would be killed. Now, I talked about this in my other video about it's easy for people like Kira who lived their whole life, fighting in the war, who are like the warrior class, who giving up their life for a cause is it comes easy to people like Kira, but people like normal people who aren't trained that way, who haven't lived that kind of life, it's a lot to ask. And I'm not saying that Kira's wrong here. I'm saying it's a lot more gray than what it's presented, but I'm not faulting the writers for that, because it's totally within Kira's character to see things in that black and white way. So I think the episode actually does a really good job in that, and that the gray area is kind of implied. I just wish perhaps they could have explored that a bit more. Because Cubis is presented as kind of a despicable character, but I think that the situation is a bit more complex. Like, I would actually agree with the sentencing for exile. I do think that's probably the best compromise, because you do have to look at it from the perspective that they would have died, and had they not, like if Cubis refused to sign the orders, the Cardassians would kill him, and they would just find someone else to sign the orders anyway. So it's not like those other Bajorans wouldn't be sentenced to death had Cubis not signed it. Cardassians wouldn't give a fuck if he signed it or not. They would just kill him and get someone else to sign it. So it wouldn't change the outcome. Those other Bajorans would still be dead. But it doesn't change the fact that Cubis was in fact complicit. That it wasn't somebody else who signed the orders. It was him. And therefore he needs to face some consequences for that. Even though you got to think about it, it's an impossible situation. Because if he refused to do it, he would be dead and there would be no one to punish. And nothing would change. So it's that's what I love about Deep Space Nine. And that's why I think this episode is quite good and a bit underrated, because it's a very gray moral area. And as I said, I think the episode should have focused a bit more on this character, because he did seem like kind of a remnant from the original idea, or more of like an afterthought, where the episode kind of forgets about him later on. But yeah, I do think it's a very good aspect. Now, I must say, though, the scene in this episode where he's first introduced, he's walking through the promenade and some random Bajoran walks up to him and says, "Don't I know you from somewhere?" He's like, No, you don't. He's like, "Wait a second, you're Secretary Cubis. This is Secretary Cubis!" And he starts freaking out. I don't know if this is just me, but that scene felt like a Babylon 5 scene. It didn't feel like a Deep Space Nine scene. Now, for any Babylon 5 fans watching this, if you think I'm harping on or sort of trashing Babylon 5 by saying that, not at all. If anything, I'm actually harping on Deep Space Nine, because a lot of Babylon 5 fans accuse Deep Space Nine of ripping off B5, which by and large, like overall, I think those accusations are unfounded, by and large. But there is some kernels of truth to it, and I think this is an example of that. That this is them sort of ripping off the style of Babylon 5 rather than staying true to their own unique style. just my opinion. I don't know. I mean, because it does kind of fit and work with the story, but just the way the scene was shot and the way it plays out, because Deep Space Nine doesn't usually have like these non-characters, who are just walking about the business on the station and they see someone and they start freaking out. Like, that's something Babylon 5 did a lot and did it well, I will say. Where here it doesn't fit. I don't think it seems really out of place. That's just my opinion, though. Anyway, so this episode's about, it brings up Parlor Beck a lot, because Beck was the man who hung himself because he was ordered to give the Cardassians information. Of course, we think at first it's a misdirection that we think that Bariel was the one who ordered him, but then we find out it was actually Opaka, and you see Parlor Beck and a lot of these orb experience flashbacks, whatever. But every time I saw him, especially every time I heard his name mentioned, I was just thinking that he's a loser baby, so why don't you kill him? I'm sorry. I just had to say that. Parlor Beck, get it? Anyway. Moving on. So, speaking of those orb things, I don't know if I really liked them in this episode. I think maybe they would have been better had there been less of them. We got like 3 different experiences, and they all pretty much imply the same thing. It's like the orb of prophecy and change, I assume, so it's like prophesizing what's going to happen, but doing it in a very cryptic way. Of course, all prophecies have to be cryptic, but it's all sort of implying the same thing. Bariel has vision of that Kira stabs him and claiming to love him, and other, like where he's kissing Kira and it turns into Kai or Vedic Winn that he's kissing. Like, it's all implying basically the same thing, and I think it kind of hammers this point home too much. It makes it a bit too on the nose of what's going to happen next. I think you could have. I think they had 3 of these, and I think they should have cut it down to at least 2, maybe even 1. I think that one they had to start out the episode is actually all you needed. Them keep returning to these orb experiences, I think, even though they were beautifully shot and nicely edited, the way it comes off is very dreamlike. But and yeah, I think the people involved in the production of this episode even said they were really impressed with the lighting and how these scenes turned out. Maybe that's why they did so many of them, because they look good, but I don't think it surfaces the story. I think it bogs the story down and makes it a bit too telegraphed of what happens later on, and that maybe they should have cut this back a bit. Anyway, getting more into some of the character aspects of this episode. First of all, and this is another thing I mentioned in my previous little segment on this video, is that Odo's being a total fucking hypocrite in this episode. I'm sorry, he is. Like, he shows up, he's like, "Oh, Secretary Kubis, good to see you. You're under arrest." And then Odo is sort of like, "Oh, blech," balking at Kubis, and Kubis is like, "Well, I never liked Dukat. I hated that tyrant." And Odo's like, "Well, you hid your feelings well." So basically, Odo's on his big high horse, but I got news for you, Odo. You work for the Cardassians as well, so get off your goddamn high horse. I mean, granted, the situation was different. Odo never signed any death warrants or anything, but as we learn later in the episode Things Past, which is actually, I would argue, the natural progression, Odo's hands weren't completely clean either. And I think something as messy as the occupation, if you work for the Cardassians, even if you tried to remain impartial, you tried to be a friend to Bajor, you work for the Cardassians, it's impossible for your hands to remain completely clean. And I would argue that there were several acts, because Odo's job was security, so many of these Bajorans that he arrested, guilty or not, even if the ones were guilty, not to mention, the one Things Past where there's Bajorans who were proven to be not guilty, Odo is handing over Bajorans for the Cardassians to kill. even if it's a minor crime, because Odo doesn't make the laws, he just follows them. So I think that many Bajorans would see Odo as a collaborator. And I think it's a bit, they never really address that. And especially the episode Things Past, when it begins, it talks about how the Bajorans idolize him, which I actually think is a bit out of character. Because, as I said, he handed over Bajorans to be killed by the Cardassians. Even if they were guilty of the crimes they committed, I think Bajorans, the other Bajorans, especially in this new environment of the free Bajor, they would see that as crimes. And so it's entirely inconsistent for me to see Odo like being on his high horse and being, oh, Secretary Kubis, you're a fucking collaborator, when Odo, arguably, people could feel the same way about him. So I think that was a bit mishandled. And also, like, this, watching this episode again reminds me of how Kira and Bariel's relationship never really worked. And I think part of this has to do with the fact that the actor who played Bariel, I don't think he's a particularly good actor. I mean, he's okay, but I think in this episode in particular, like, whenever, like, some of those more serious, more dour scenes, I think he does a really good job. But I never buy his character when he's being lighthearted, particularly in the scenes we get with him and Kira together, like, being like, oh, you have time to be on the station. Like, I never buy their relationship, and a lot of that has to do with his performance. I don't think he does that lighthearted side of it, of Bariel, very well. I just never buy it. So I do think, in part, like, getting rid of his character was the smart thing. And I have no doubt that the showrunners could also see that this relationship just was not working. So I do think that's kind of a downturn of the episode, because much of this episode's impact depends on Kira, the rift that's formed between Kira and Bariel. But if you never really bought their relationship in the first place, that makes that rift a lot less impactful. But one thing I did really love about this episode was the scene where Vedic Winn goes to Sisko and in a very, like, cryptic way tries to get him to endorse her, but very sort of backhanded. And he spots this, and he tells us, he's like, because Vedic's like, oh, how some people think that we're at odds with each other, but that's totally not true. I totally respect the Federation. I totally want to be, and Sisko's like, okay, well, if that's the way you feel, I would appreciate it if you made your feelings public. She's like, sure. Hey, I got an idea. Why don't we make it public together? Why don't we just go to the Vedic Assembly and we can profess our undying love and allegiance to each other? And Sisko's like, okay, sure. Next week, after the election. And she's like, oh, why not now? And he's like, well, some people might misconstrue this as an endorsement for you for Kai. And of course, that's what she was getting at. And I love this scene. I love it so much. And this is one of my favorite portrayals of Winn. Now, I talk about some of the portrayals of Winn that I love and some that I don't like. The ones I don't like was that the episode Rapture, for example. I didn't like her portrayal there because she was shown as someone who actually cared about the Prophets and cared about Bajor and who was helping Sisko. And to me, that totally goes against her character. I think her character has established from the very beginning. And I would say I like her portrayal here even better than, say, her first appearance in the Hands of the Prophets, because there she was even like, in contrast to, you got the Rapture on. Well, it's not Rapture. Was it Rapture? Yeah, it was. I'm getting confused with the sixth season episode. No, that was Reckoning. Okay, so the fifth season episode is Rapture. Yeah, so it's Rapture. So you got Rapture on one side, where Kai Winn's being this, good, I love the Prophets person, which I totally don't buy. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have In the Hands of the Prophets, where she's like completely evil and tries to kill Vedic Bariel and has this whole conspiracy. Now, I didn't like that portrayal of her either, not as much, because I think on that side, she's a bit too evil that she would actually conspire to, like, assassinate her political opponent. Whereas this portrayal of her, I actually think is the best. It's like the in-between, because it's where she's a smug, power-hungry politician. Even though she's religious, arguably more of a religious figure, but in the culture such as Bajor, where religion wields so much power, because religion has so much importance over the culture, it is a position of power. It is just as powerful, arguably even more powerful than the actual government of Bajor. And I think that's made clear later on, because she's always brought in, like, when Bajor negotiates with the Dominion, it's not Shakar who does it, it's Winn that does it. And there's a lot of other examples where it's shown that the Vedic Assembly wields just as much power, if not more, particularly social power and perceivable power by the Bajoran people. Even if the Bajoran government holds more of the regulations and what policy, they enact policy more than the religious wing does. The religious wing has more social power to move the people in a certain direction. So she's power hungry. She is basically a politician, even if she technically isn't one. And this scene really sells that. And I love how deep, because she is so politician-like in the scene. She's very devious, like very underscoring, like trying to, and I love how they portray Sisko in the scene too, because he's savvy. He wasn't born yesterday. He can pick up on this right away. How she has this whole pretext of, oh, I'm friends, we're all friends, I love you, and she's trying to trick Sisko into endorsing her. But he can tell this, and he sort of sidesteps this. And this is it's similar to earlier in this episode where she confronts Kira, and Kira is like being outright hostile to her, saying that you tried to have Bariel killed last time, we don't trust you, I'm going to keep an eye on you. And the way she's not antagonistic to Kira at all about this, she sort of sidesteps it and tries to politically maneuver around it, which I love. By the way, I was a bit disappointed that they didn't mention that she was complicit in the attempted coup by the Circle, which happened earlier this season, but I suppose it's not public knowledge that she was. But she was sitting right beside, what's-his-face, the dude from Dave and Frost Nixon, when he was, like, in a brief period of time he took power, so I think it was pretty obvious she was complicit in that. So I think it's like, I'm a bit disappointed they didn't bring that up, because that's definitely another strike against her. But yeah, I think this is the perfect portrayal. And by the way, and I talked about this in other videos, the ending story arc of season 7, where she turns to the Pal race and she joins up with Dukat to unleash the Pal race to kill the prophets. A lot of people were against that and said it was totally against her character, which I 1000% disagree. I think it was 100% on her character. Even though, like I said, that in the hands of prophets, I thought they portrayed her too evil. I don't think that other thing was too evil, which may sound a bit crazy, because that was downright evil. She was literally trying to unleash evil on the world. But the reason why I think that works for her character, the way it's portrayed here, is because she's power hungry. And I think they earned that progression by showing at first she was rejecting of what she thought of evil her whole life, but when it was threatened that she would lose her power, and it was also promised she would gain more power. Of course she's going to do this. That's all she cares about is power. And I think that comes across so well in this episode. Now, moving on, let's see here. What else have we got? Oh yeah, so let's talk about Vedic Bariel and how he tries to take the fall for Kai Opaka. I did really love this. And this kind of ties into how Bariel he's kind of too good to be the Kai. I love how this kind of implies, because you have other cliches that you see in Deep Space Nine or Star Trek or even other films and shows that the best person who has power is the one who doesn't like power. When Worf kills Gowron and makes Martok the Emperor, they're saying, oh, because it's always the thing, whoever doesn't want power. They even touched on this in Game of Thrones a couple of times, is that whoever doesn't want power is the best one to lead, because they're not going to be ambitious or power hungry the way Winn is. But what I love about this episode, and I think it's a bit more realistic spin on that theme, is someone who is absolutely good and the right person to lead probably isn't going to get the power. It's particularly if the system that they're involved in is corrupt. And this sort of, because Bariel is kind of too good for his own good, if you know what I'm saying, because he was not guilty of what he was accused of doing. He was covering for Kai Opaka. And he was so good that he refused to sully Opaka's name that he did not get elected. So that speaks more, and this is what I often say, like in modern politics, not to get, I'm going to get more into politics later on, just to forewarn you, but just to sort of dip my toes in it at the second. It is kind of relatable to modern day politics, where everyone's like, oh, we need a good president, we need someone who's heroic, who has a strong, sense of morality, who's like completely honest. And but I think that's completely unrealistic, because such a person would never become president or whatever in the system that we have. If the system is corrupt, it excludes the possibility of such a person ever becoming the leader. And even if that person did, that person would be unable to lead from a position of integrity, because the system would prevent him or her from doing so. And I think that is definitely a lot more complex and realistic way of looking at governmental structures. And that's basically what this episode does. It basically says that Bariel is so good that it ends up being his downfall, and he doesn't get elected because he's too good. And because, and so instead it goes to someone like Winn, who's completely corrupt and power hungry, because that's what the system endorses. That's what the system encourages. It's the system that's corrupt, not the particular person. I love that. I absolutely love that. Anyway, before I touch more into that, let me get into a few more character stuff, such as the scene where Odo and Kira go to Quark and ask for his help. I love this scene. This, to me, even in second season, like some people try to say, oh, season 2 was kind of a piss poor season. They try to compare it to like season 2 of Next Gen or season 2 of Enterprise, which in my opinion, Deep Space Nine's heads in hell. Even though season 2 is definitely one of the lower seasons of Deep Space Nine, that the later seasons got much better. Although I would argue season 2 was just as good as season 5, which is my opinion. But anyway, the first 2 seasons are seen as subpar. But even season 2, I would argue, is still a really great season, and better than season 2 of other shows, other Star Trek shows. Voyager being the only exception. And this scene, because it's an indicator of the kind of great dialogue, great character interactions that felt natural, that were so interesting to watch. They were just sprinkled throughout the show. And this is such an enjoyable scene where Odo and Kira go to Quark, and they're just standing there, and he's like, what did I do? And they're like, oh, nothing. Why do you think something's wrong? What would make you think that? It's like, and then Odo's like, well, it's simple. It's because we've been here, we haven't insulted him, we haven't arrested him, or we haven't accused him of doing something. And he's like, yeah, you're making me crazy. And of course, they ask him to break into the vetting file so they can get the information. I love Quark's response to that. He's like, oh, isn't that illegal? I just love that. And Odo's like, oh, sparrows. And of course, like, he starts doing his illegal things, and Odo's like peeking over. It's like, what? How are you doing this? And Quark eventually is like, shoves him away. It's like, I'll get back to you in a few hours. Like, this just is such a good scene. It's just so great. So it's just an example of the great character interactions that are just so everyday occurrence on Deep Space Nine. Anyway, it's also another thing of note in this episode is when a scene where Kieran is talking to Odo and Kieran just mentions that she loves Bariel, you can see Odo's reaction of being, oh really? And being disturbed by this, but is very instantly and just disappears. So it shows that this is instinctual, natural reaction, but he tries to hide it very quickly, which was very nice foreshadowing for Odo having a crush on Kira. In fact, it's arguably is what the writers based Odo's eventually crush on Kira on. Was this because apparently this, like, it wasn't written in the script. In fact, the screenwriter for this episode said that he was really surprised when the episode aired and he saw that. I couldn't find out if this was the actor's decision or the director's decision. People seem to imply it was simply the actor's decision to do this on the day. And it's so funny that such a minor reaction could spawn this whole reoccurring storyline that would have ripples throughout the rest of the show. Because even if it was like the director's decision to do this, it wasn't something that the producers and writers had decided, but they had kind of seen it and based like their future scripts off of that small little reaction, which I thought was very nice. Alright, so let me delve now deep into the politics. And when I did my Star Trek episode polls and this was an option, I warned you, anyone who voted for this episode, I warned you that I would get a bit into some, I would say more social commentary than politics, but I will delve not deep, but a little bit into modern day politics. So if that isn't your thing, now's the time for you to bail out. Because I know not everyone voted for this episode, first of all, and even those who did, maybe this wasn't why. But anyway, so what I love about this episode is that a scandal preventing the right person from getting elected. Why does that sound familiar? I'm sure, even if you disagree with my thinking here, I'm sure you know what I'm getting at. Is that the current president that we had only got elected because of the scandal for his opponent. I do strongly believe that a lot of people were not voting for him. They were voting against his opponent because of the scandal, which I think is ridiculous. And I think, as we can see from a result, our government is suffering, and it's not a good situation. It's all because people got distracted from a scandal. So for me, it just shows the power of a scandal, which is why I would, even though, of course, because this episode was made decades before this incident happened, so of course it had nothing to do with the influence of the writers, but I would actually say this is a better analogy than comparing it to Nixon, because in Nixon's case, the scandal, people were justified in being outraged by that particular scandal, and not having that person as president because it illustrated that wasn't the right person to become president. But that's not the case. That's not what happens in this episode. In this episode, the right person is prevented from becoming the Kai or position of leadership because people were distracted by a scandal. And yeah, I just think that perfectly describes what happened more recently. I warned you I was going to get into politics, but that's definitely what I'm struck by when I watch this episode. And it's kind of what I touched on earlier about how it's more about if the system's corrupt, then it will prevent people of integrity. Not that I'm saying that Clinton was a person of integrity, but at least she wasn't as corrupt or destructive or mainly just crazy as the alternative, which people were too distracted by a scandal to see. And I do think that a lot of people since years looking back in retrospect actually see what a big of a mistake they made because they let themselves be distracted by a scandal. But anyway, I'm sorry. I warned you. I had to get that off my chest. But what is more interesting about this is that the aspect of the truth will not set you free, because that's a very common perspective that if you're honest and truthful, only good things will come to you. But the reality is, especially in a system that's corrupt or not completely perfect, it doesn't even have to be corrupt, it's not incredibly perfect, this is not always going to be the case. Sometimes the truth, by being an honest person of integrity, it will hurt you. And it's funny that Bariel would have became Kai if he didn't have so much damn integrity. If he just been actually no, it wasn't me, that was Kai Opaka, here I can prove it, and people would be, oh, okay, well, Bariel's such a great person for trying to cover up for Opaka. But no, he wouldn't do that because he had too much integrity. And so we have this corrupt, evil person. Well, evil is a bit more simplistic, but you know what I'm saying. A corrupt, let's say, liar who becomes Kai instead because Bariel has too much integrity. So because he feels like he's doing the right thing, because he has integrity, because he wants to respect the image and the spirit of Opaka, he's willing to sacrifice himself. But by doing so, you might say, oh, that's such a courageous step of self-sacrifice. But it's not self-sacrifice, because he's not the only one who suffers. Because as a result of his actions, Bajor has a corrupt leader instead of a good, honest leader. If you know what I'm saying, it's like his integrity was so high, it actually ends up causing more harm than good, if you look at it that way. Because he felt like he was doing the right thing, Winn becomes Kai, and she causes a lot more havoc and damage. And by the way, just to clarify, I'm no longer relating it back to the current election. Like, this aspect of it doesn't actually fit. I wouldn't call Clinton the person by integrity, so don't twist my words to make me say that. She was just not as bad as an alternative to the other. That's what I'm saying. But anyway, so I'm no longer making that comparison. But it is an interesting way to look at if the system is corrupt or doesn't work, then it's impossible for someone who is the perfect example of integrity and honesty to become the leader. I don't know. That's my take of this episode, and I think that is a very strong take, and that's why I really like it. But let me get into another sort of moral question that this episode brings up that I think is very interesting, is that was Opaka morally wrong for what she did? I mean, so even if Bariel was responsible for doing that, and we find out that it's Opaka who did it, and this is very interesting because I've read that the actress who played Opaka, when she read the script, she totally sided with her. She's like, I don't think Opaka did anything wrong. She was actually a hero. She actually went as far to say that she should have been celebrated as a hero. And this is getting back to the old Spock axiom of the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Because what Opaka did is that she sacrificed 1,200 people. I believe it was 1,200. I don't know, a handful of resistant fighters. She sacrificed them, including her own son, in order to save thousands. Because the Cardassians were threatening to kill thousands of Bajoran as retribution if they did not give up the resistance fighters. Now, of course, the Cardassians were not in the right to do that, but that's beyond Opaka's hands or any other Bajoran's hands. The only thing they could control is that they could give up a handful of Bajorans to save thousands more. And you gotta wonder, is that a decision Spock would have made? I think he would have. Is that a decision Sisko would have made? Well, look at the episode In the Pale Moonlight, where he is complicit in murder, in killing and lying and deceiving in order to save billions of lives. So that's a bigger scale, though. So maybe if you slim it down to a smaller scale where the divide isn't so vast, you could argue maybe Sisko wouldn't do it. But I think there's a good argument to be made, not that it's a foregone conclusion, but there's a good argument to be made that he would. That Spock would. And you think of these people as people with integrity, people who want to do the right thing. So also, I love how Kira and the other Bajorans don't see it that way, because I think that's true to reality, that they would see Bariel or Opaka, who they learn it's actually Opaka, not Bariel, but they would see her as a traitor, because they would look at it in simplistic terms. And I think that is the way, that is true to modern times and how the media present things. And when someone is brought out for a crime or whatever, people never look at the complexities involved and just see it as, oh, this person's evil, this person's good. And I love that. This is why I think this is an underrated episode. Anyway, my rating for the Collaborator out of 10 is an 8. Extremely good. As I said, I do think some things hold this episode back. I think it had too many orb experiences. I think the inclusion of Kubis was interesting, but they didn't take it far enough. It seems kind of like an afterthought, and they kind of dropped it in favor of this Bariel stuff, and I don't think Bariel's a particularly good actor, and I didn't buy his relationship with Kira. But I do love how complex the social commentary in this episode is. It's not straightforward. It shows how gray the area is. In fact, I mistakenly thought that the quote that Odo says, the problem with giving people the freedom of choice is sometimes they make the wrong choice. I thought that was in this episode, but actually that comes later in the 3rd season episode, Shakar. But I think that quote does also apply so much to this episode as well. As that, sometimes people do make the wrong choice, because sometimes the way people make decisions on mass issues like this is knee-jerk reactions rather than thinking through the complications. It's not to say, even if they did think through the complications, that they wouldn't still come to the same conclusion. They may. But it's just to say that certain issues, particularly this one of what Opaka did and what Bariel took the fall for, was it really that clean cut and simple, or is it a bit more complex? And of course, I love the commentary about how Bariel couldn't. I think this is I really got to congratulate the writers, because the writers decided that they did not want Bariel to become Kai, because it wouldn't work for the show. So the way they went about doing it, what would be his downfall? His downfall is that he's too good of a person to become Kai, which is really why they didn't want him to become Kai from a story writing perspective. And so they make that an in-universe reason of that this system is too corrupt for such an honest person. And god damn, I love that. I love the commentary on that. But as I said, it's not a perfect episode. There are some drawbacks inherent to season 2, but still, in my opinion, a really underrated one. Anyway, that is it for my review of The Collaborator. Thanks so much for watching this. You can check out my channel as I do more Star Trek reviews. I still have, I believe I have a couple of Star Trek polls up. They might have been finished by now, but if not, I'll have some new polls up shortly where you can vote on which episode I want to review next. So be sure to check out my channel as I do many more Star Trek videos, as well as videos on other shows like The Expanse, Lost, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.